Hello and welcome all to Victorian Time Travel, the podcast where we get ready to travel back in time. We'll pick a very, very specific Victorian time and place each episode and try to learn everything we can about it so we don't put our foot in it once we're there. I'm Amy, your time travel researcher, and just to put you all at ease, there is some method to the madness. I do have some education in this historical period, but of course, I'm not an expert on everything. So I'd be really, really grateful if you have the time and energy to do so. If you could let me know when there's anything you want to correct, especially when it comes to the sadly inescapable systems of oppression that permeated this historical period. For every episode, check out the transcript for full citations so you can find my sources and you can prepare even more thoroughly for your journey. So I was looking for inspiration for my next time jump and I was scrolling down my Pinterest as one does. And yes, I get the cute animals and the tempting craft projects that I save to a folder and then I never look at again. But then, in the midst of all this, there it was. Glorious, maximalist, so many elements you don't even know where to look. A late 19th century advertisement for caramels. And there's a ship, there's a globe, there's a bunch of medals. There is so much writing on each of the tiny sails, on the globe, next to the globe, above and below the globe. And I want to go and have a chat with whoever's responsible for this advert. So let's prepare to do just that. As always, when you look into anything, you end up uncovering how it's all connected. And actually, caramel adverts say a whole lot about all sorts of public, social, economic, and political issues. So before we analyze this 1897 advert, we need a bit of context. So, sugar. First of all, if you're interested in looking at history through the lens of sugar, you just have to read Sidney Mintz's book, Sweetness and Power, The Place of Sugar in Modern History. It's from 1986, so it's not the newest text, but it has a whole overview of how sugar influenced all aspects of society, how it was used to do that, and just go and have a read. And by the way, this is a classic. I haven't discovered a hidden gem or anything. I'm just recommending it. One thing that's interesting about sugar is that in England in the 17th century, it rose to prominence as a foodstuff for the wealthiest members of society at first. But then, sure enough, it changed from being a luxury to something that everyone of every class consumed. And by 1900, it constituted an estimated 1/6 of the calorific intake of the average British person, according to some sources. Now, the way they got to that figure is probably different from how we'd calculate it now. But as a comparison, I looked up how much sugar there is in the, I hope you don't mind me saying, notoriously sugar-heavy contemporary US diet. And I hope no US listener takes this the wrong way, but 1/6 of the average diet in 1900, that is more than in the US diet of today. So it's a lot. And it's a big jump from luxury to everybody. And we'll talk a bit more about this later, about the health and the social effects of this increase in sugar consumption. But first, there's another very important role that sugar had in the early 19th century, and that's in relation to the abolitionist movement. A lot of the sugar consumed in Britain was grown and produced by enslaved people in various colonies. So the abolitionists either boycotted sugar altogether or they encouraged people to use ethical alternatives. They sold beautiful glass bowls with golden lettering that read East India sugar not made by slaves. And of course, we wouldn't consider indentured laborers in the East Indies an acceptable ethical alternative, but that was the messaging that they used. And there's some fascinating reading to do about this early example of consumer activism. I'd really recommend an article by Smith and Johns from the Journal of Business Ethics titled Historicizing Modern Slavery, Free-Grown Sugar as an Ethics-Driven Market Category in 19th Century Britain. It's not the snappiest title, but really good. And another article I'd recommend is Richard Huss's Free Trade, Free Labour and Slave Sugar in Victorian Britain from the Historical Journal. And I'm going to broadly follow Huss's historical timeline here to provide an overview. And it'll be a bit simplified, I'm sorry, but please bear with me. So, before 1833, the year that slavery was abolished in Britain, a lot of the sugar imported and consumed in Britain was grown and produced by enslaved people. Then, after the abolition, there was a period from 1833 to 1846, so about 13 years, where the government introduced protectionist measures, which basically ensured that only sugar produced in the British colonies was consumed in Britain. So they made it very hard to import sugar from anywhere else. And that avoided the ethics issue, I guess, because labour in the British colonies was no longer enslaved. Of course, this is an oversimplification. The conditions of previously enslaved people didn't just get better overnight. But in 1846, after these 13 years of protectionism, the duties on foreign sugar were lifted, meaning that, one, the price of sugar dropped, hence that huge growth in consumption that we mentioned earlier. And two, the British market was flooded by sugar grown by enslaved people from non-British colonies where slavery had not yet been abolished. So people weren't quite as outraged when the enslaved people who produced the sugar went from non-British colonies. And there are many things that contributed to that. And those two articles I mentioned go into some of those reasons. And unfortunately, partially, one of the reasons this was because of an increase in racist attitudes throughout the century. Well, what this means is that we enter a period of contradictions. Britain was officially anti-slavery and its navy blockaded the slave trade in the seas. And at the same time, they imported and consumed the products of enslaved labour back at home. If the general public wasn't as concerned about labour practices anymore in this period, following the abolition of slavery, they had moved on to a new concern, and that was adulteration. They were really worried about sugar not being pure, being contaminated, and for good reason. There were some high-profile scandals, including surrounding contaminated sugar, that led, for example, to the Adulteration of Foods Act. So laws had to be introduced. Now, finally, onto the advert. If you're watching, here it is on screen. And if you're listening, I'll post a picture with a transcript and also I'll describe it right now. So it's a whole page advert in the February 1897 issue of the trade publication The British and Foreign Confectioner, Baker and Restaurateur. This is a monthly trade publication and it's targeted at bakers, pastry cooks and sugar confectioners everywhere. And at the top, it has Clarnico Caramels in a very fancy, elaborate font. Then it has a dotted line, and then the central picture is a ship with many sails, each of which has writing on it, and the ship is resting on a globe. And then the globe is covered in medals and has a band with writing on it. And then on either side of the globe, the text reads absolute purity and standard quality. And at the bottom, the text is Sole Makers, Clark, Nichols and Coombs Limited, Hackney Wicks Works, London, NE. And the reason that I wanted to have a little trip in my time machine and have a chat with anyone involved in the making of this advert is that, as you can see, there's a lot going on. Lots of symbols and medals, and also it looks a bit different from other adverts from the period. At least to me, it looked a bit different. So the first port of call was the British Library to look at the British and Foreign Confectioner and look at the other adverts on there. And I looked at every issue from 1897 because I'm thorough and I tried to find any patterns. Did I find any? Did I just waste a lot of time? I did not waste my time. For one, as already mentioned, in this latter half of the 19th century, people were concerned about adulteration. So this absolute purity writing on the side, it's part of a trend. I mean, this advert has already 3 times the word purity. The other 2 are on the ship. But about half of the advertisements in the February issue of the British and Foreign Confectioner include variations of the word pure. So this is something people are very aware of. But while it is part of a trend, comparing all these adverts also confirm that this is an interesting advert. Clarnico, the company running it, seemed to understand that visual elements will attract the eye. And it looks admittedly a bit busy for our modern eyes, but if you compare it to some of the other adverts where sometimes you can't even tell what the brand is called and it's just like a solid wall of text. I mean, Clarnico are the only ones who changed up their adverts in the November 1897 issue to make them seasonal and festive. And it seems obvious to have Christmassy adverts in the run up to Christmas if you're selling sweets, but they're the only ones that do it here. And now, granted, this is a trade publication. I'm not making claims about all adverts in all media. So, if we're going to take this trip, we're going to bump into someone working at Clarnico. So let's make sure we know something about it. Clarnico is short for Clark, Nichols and Coombs. They were established in 1872 and they went on to become the country's largest confectioners in the 1940s. So don't let that slip when we travel back in time because we don't want them to get too cocky. And that's all in the future for them. They were one of the first companies to introduce profit sharing for their workers in the 1890s, and they had a bunch of worker schemes like 7 weeks of paid sick leave, a dowry of £5 to female workers who married, and various clubs and charitable groups. So a quite interesting way of running a company, especially for that period. And these schemes were introduced by the managing directors of Clark, Nichols and Coombs. I'm sorry, unfortunately not a Mr. Clark or Nichols or Coombs, but instead Alexander Horne and George Mathieson, who were both former labourers. So for our time travel trip, I think we should focus on Mathieson because he wrote a lot about sugar and business. He wrote in trade publications, newspapers, for political science associations, and more. So we can find out a lot about his thinking from all this writing that he did. And so when we meet him, we can hopefully have an intelligent conversation about what his aims were with the company and with this advert in particular. Mathieson wrote a paper in 1898 titled Should Sugar Be Shackled? And it was published by the Confectioners Union. And I'm going to focus on this text because otherwise there's just too much to cover here. And here he argues against proposed countervailing duties, which are import taxes on non-British sugar. And should sugar be shackled, apart from being quite fun to say, it shows that Mathieson has an awareness of the trends in consumer behaviour and expectations. He criticises the West Indies colonists, and by colonists he means the British business owners, and he accuses them of mismanaging labour, cutting salaries recklessly, failing to diversify their industry. He says they use outdated extraction methods, they don't contribute to the local economy, they waste money on foreign labour and imported food, and this is all very bad, of course, but perhaps worst of all, these West Indies sugar producers have no business acumen. Mathieson says they don't care about the quality of the product and they continue to ship their sugar in what he calls dirty casks. And he suggests that they should deliver their product in attractive packaging, displaying their brand names. This is very interesting, especially if we read this alongside the advert with its, shall we say, abundance of branding. I mean, there's even a tiny flag on top of the ship that reads Tomatonic, and that's a registered trademark for a gelling agent they have. And these are the early days of stuff like brand identity and brand recognition. And Mathieson recognizes there's a link between advertising and consumption. And he says cane sugar, which has reputational problems, should be inspired by the cocoa industry, who managed to make themselves very popular through what he calls bold advertising. There are some advertising handbooks from the period that call the late 19th century the golden age of trademarks, and Mathieson argues cane sugar has not kept up. Now, something to keep in mind is that, as mentioned, this is an advert in a trade publication. I went on to some online newspaper archives and checked out Clarnico's adverts there, and they do tend to be smaller and text only in most of the mainstream publications. So this advert is very much aimed at industry people rather than the general public, perhaps, and that's just something to keep in mind. We've talked about Clarnico, we've talked about Mathieson. Let's address the globe plus ship-shaped elephant in the room. Sure, the obvious connotation is that it's about international trade, but it also looks a little bit international domination-y. Is that what Matheson wanted? Is that a direction that our conversation with him might end up going in when we meet him? Well, I'm a researcher, not a mind reader, so I'm not sure. But my hunch is that for Matheson, at least, it really is more about trade than it is about political power. Now, of course, everything is interconnected, but his writing really is about free trade. And call me naive, but he seems to truly believe in it. He uses very emotional language. He uses religious expressions. He refers to the economic faith that is in us as if free trade were some sort of inevitability that society always moves towards. And he uses scientific terminology. He applies the famous evolutionary concept of survival of the fittest to commerce, for example. His point is that reintroducing import taxes on sugar from non-British sources is a form of protectionism, which is against everything that free trade is about. Of course, to note is that by the 1890s, when he's writing, virtually none of the sugar was grown by what was understood at the time to be enslaved labor. So he's more concerned about the economic impact. And he sprinkled in rousing statements like, "It is not bounties that confectioners value as the charter and cause of their expansion. It is freedom." So as you can see, he is basically a freedom fighter, and his fight is import tax. Now, I'm sorry, George. Can I call you George? I'm making fun, but I get a sense that you are genuine in your emphasis on the free part of free trade. Matheson seems to honestly believe that it's the way forward to reach freedom in every aspect of society and not just for the economy. And as we've seen before as well, with all those worker schemes and the profit sharing at his company, he is really pro worker. He's not that stereotype of the heartless capitalist. And in this paper specifically, he suggests that laborers in the West Indies should be granted land, the land that they work on, and that sugar production should be set up as cooperative enterprises, and that the local workforce should have more independence. Despite all this, it's hard to ignore the imperialistic colonial connotations of the massive ship on a stylized globe, especially given the history of sugar. If you want to read more about this and perhaps engage in a lively discussion with Matheson when you meet him in your time travels, Anandi Ramamurthy has a great book called Imperial Persuaders: Images of Africa and Asia in British Advertising. And that book actually has an analysis of a tobacco advert from a similar period featuring a globe. And it's very interesting, but we've already been talking for a very long time, so that's something for a future episode. Despite Matheson's quite anti-racist and pro-worker views, especially for the time, something that he and others bring up a lot is that introducing these taxes will increase the price of sugar, and that will have a negative effect on the British working class. And the British workers, they're closer to home, and people are very worried about them. What happened is that, as we mentioned at the start, people ate a lot of sugar, and it had become a nutritional necessity. People would go hungry if they couldn't afford sugar. Some have called the increase in average sugar consumption in Britain the single most important dietary change of the 19th century, increasing 5 times from 1800 to 1900. Matheson himself says that sugar is one of the most important and nutritious articles of food, and he quotes an average per capita consumption of £80 a year. For reference, the 2020 figures in the UK are around £45 per year. And it is possible, like we said before, that this number was reached in a different way, but it's a big difference. And according to the British Nutrition Foundation, the recommended amount for adults is £24 per year. So we're talking £24 recommended for good health, 45 average right now, and 80 in the late 1890s. But Matheson doesn't quote this number as a health concern, at least not in the sense that he thinks it's too much. His concern, as touched on earlier, is that it would hurt people's health if they couldn't afford sugar anymore because they relied so much on it for energy and calories. And we can look at trends in sugar consumption to confirm that it was those who couldn't afford the higher prices who consumed the most sugar. It's bad for your health to go hungry. In fact, politicians could make themselves very popular by campaigning to keep sugar prices low. And of course, people who couldn't afford expensive sugar liked that. But here we can also glimpse a less generous way in which sugar may have been seen by those in power. There was a sense among upper classes that sugar encouraged the working classes to engage in less disruptive pastimes. They were having sugar with their teas and their coffees, and that kept them away from drinking alcohol in excess. And if we want to get even more cynical about it, sugar could be considered a kind of sticking plaster on the terrible diets of the working class, which obviously lacked a lot of nutrients. And in this view, sugar is a deliberately low-quality source of calories and energy to keep the working classes in their place. Quite dark. And there's more on this, including the claim that sugar provided the calories that fueled the Industrial Revolution in an article by Austin and Smith titled Private Tooth Decay as Public Economic Virtue, which is just a great title, Private Tooth Decay, Public Economic Virtue. And going back to the advert, there are more conventional references to good health, what we would consider good health as well. So, for example, the globe is inscribed with whole fruit jams, and jam, by the way, acted as a substitute for unaffordable butter, so one of those key sources of energy. So we have the suggestion, which resonates today, I think, that whole fruit is better than the alternative, whatever that is. And this writing is surrounded above and below by commemorative medals, and Clarnico was present at various health exhibitions, including the International Health Exhibition of 1884, which is the medal on the top left. And I very nearly lost my mind trying to identify these medals, because I don't want to embarrass myself in front of Mathieson when I meet him, but you can't really read the writing on them. So what I did is I scrolled down Google Images for several hours, looking at 19th century commemorative coins until I found one that looked like that on some collectioner's website. And luckily I could confirm this because Clarnico is listed in a digitized catalogue for that health exhibition in 1884, which you can find on archive.org. So it was the right one. And there they exhibited jams, candied and drained peels, and confectionery. And now some of these things we might consider healthy today, but some not so much. So we have to consider that healthy at this time could refer to a range of characteristics. We've touched on healthy just being a way of saying it has energy, it keeps you alive. That's healthy. And there were also claims, especially in the 18th and early 19th century, that sugar had restorative properties for various illnesses. And some even recommended it in toothpaste recipes, and I'm not sure what the logic is there. But throughout sugar's history, even when sugar was attributed miraculous healing abilities, people knew it could be bad for you to some extent. In the 17th century, they already knew sugar could hurt your teeth, and they connected too much sugar to diabetes, excessive weight, especially in women for some reason, and with low mood. Now, an advert for caramels isn't going to advertise these health concerns, but this may not even be what they meant by healthy. What people were worried about was this big purity issue. So healthy could mean unadulterated, since you could be very sick from contaminated foodstuff. For example, there were claims in this period that cane sugar was healthier than beet sugar, but scientists at this time already knew that the chemical composition of cane and beet sugar is the same. So when they said healthier, what they meant is beet sugar was at the center of a public health scandal. People ate food, including sugar, that had been maliciously contaminated and had died from it. Cane sugar was involved in no such scandal. So, healthy, doesn't kill you. And appealing to the consumer's very real fears and anxieties in these ways, I mean, we see that in marketing today all the time. And it could be considered quite insidious. And we are almost getting to the end of the episode, but I'm just going to drop one more great book title, Consuming Angels, which is about advertising and Victorian women by Laurie Ann Loeb. And that's because Loeb makes a very cool point about how these adverts, yes, they're appealing to your fears about contamination and health, which is fair enough. But by using words like absolute purity, they are almost, in Loeb's words, evoking the evangelical wariness of the taint of sin, which is a lovely poetic way of saying that these adverts are using these manipulative tactics that we see in adverts today, suggesting that if you consume a product, you too can be pure, you too can avoid being tainted by impurities. So, what have we learned today in preparation for our trip back to the late 1800s to meet the co-director of Clarnico Confectioners? It's what always happens when you think you're looking at one little specific thing, and what you actually find is that you look at sugar and sugar products in advertisements and at debates surrounding sugar-related issues in the papers, and you get a picture of everything. You get a picture of a Britain that's undergoing a lot of changes. It's coming up against a lot of contradictions. On one hand, sugar is a key commodity in an increasingly capitalistic world. On the other, it's tied with colonialism and outdated economic systems, and that's keeping it from modernizing and keeping up. On another hand, just go with me on this one, there'll be a lot of hands, it was at the center of free trade debates, and on the other, it continued to be produced inefficiently. It was, yes, it's another hand, why not? It was hailed as the success story of free trade, which promoted progress and greater freedom, while also exacerbating issues around labour, exploitation, and class divide. It used to be a main concern of ethical consumption activists, and later in the century becomes just another product in the greedy and cruel market of free trade, to be kept as cheap as possible, to allow, and more cynically perhaps to encourage, the working classes to consume lots of it. It was one of the first luxuries that transformed into working class everyday necessities. It's a vital part of the diets of the poorest in society, and at the same time, it's a harmful substance. Sugar permeated every aspect of British society in the late 19th century. And by looking at how it was portrayed in advertisements, we get an incredible glimpse at all the contradictions that characterize that period. So I hope you feel ready now to have an intelligent conversation with George Mathieson. Thank you all for listening to Victorian Time Travel. Dress up in period appropriate warm clothes and have a good trip and stay safe.